Welcome back, my friends, to AA Recovery Interviews. I'm your host, Howard L., and I'm an alcoholic. Sober since January 1st, 1988, one day at a time. I'm grateful you've joined us. AA Recovery Interviews is the podcast where Alcoholics Anonymous members from around the world share their timeless and extraordinary stories of experience, strength, and hope. There are more than 170 awesome interviews in the AA Recovery Interviews podcast series. Listen to every hour-long episode on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube Music, or wherever you get your podcasts. Each story is a powerful testimony of the recovery available to all in Alcoholics Anonymous. Today is an encore episode of my interview with Leigh P., originally released September 9th, 2021. Leigh has been an active sober member of Alcoholics Anonymous since March 1995. Today, my longtime friend, Leigh P., shares his fascinating story in this, the 43rd episode in this podcast series. Leigh was born and raised in London, where his early adolescent experience with alcohol began in the public houses or pubs. These establishments were and still are the centers of gathering in the town where Leigh grew up. Despite the fact that he was underage, having a pint or two of beer at the pub was an unremarkable occurrence, largely ignored by those around him. As he came of age, Leigh's drinking in and outside of pubs escalated above and beyond the realm of normal drinking, and he quickly found himself drinking much more than his mates. Like many budding problem drinkers, he became a functional alcoholic, achieving scholastic success by day while drinking and often blacking out during the evenings and on weekend binges. By the time he was well into his first job after college, Leigh's drinking had become problematic and obvious to everyone but him. After moving to Texas early in his career in the oil industry, his daily alcohol consumption and blackouts were mostly managed, though his first marriage succumbed to the ruinous effects of alcoholism. But the moniker of functional alcoholic faded quickly as his drinking spiraled out of control. Finally, after a 2-week blackout, he awoke, strapped down to a psychiatric hospital gurney, and realized he was finished. A visit shortly thereafter by a responsible fellow of AA coincided with a brief interval of clarity for Leigh. He soon found his way into the rooms of Alcoholics Anonymous. He started doing the work, and the results followed. In many ways, Leigh's story is cut from the same cloth as many recovering alcoholics, and his 26 years of sobriety reflect the very fundamentals of AA. Whether his service work was taking AA into prisons or working with sponsees, Leigh combined those commitments with regular attendance at AA meetings to create a program centered in the middle of the bed, as many of my British friends like to call it. As you take in Leigh's simple yet practical wisdom for working the program, I think you'll sense his quiet confidence that his higher power is indubitably running the show. Though it's the product of 26 years in AA, Leigh's story may likely inspire and invigorate your experience in the program, no matter how long you've been sober. With that, I give you today's AA Recovery Interviews guest for the next 65 minutes, Leigh P.
My name is Leigh, and I'm alcoholic.
Thanks, Leigh. So good to have you here today. I haven't seen you in person in, a year and a half?
Year and a half since COVID.
Yeah, that's amazing how much time has gone by. And I like the opportunities that you and I had to share person to person when we went to the AA retreats that you and I went to.
Holy name.
Now, yours is not quite a southern accent. What?
Well, originally I'm from East Texas, but no.
Yeah.
Well, it's quite a bit east of Texas, actually. I'm originally from the UK. I was born and raised in England, in London. Went to school there, and when I left school, a company in the oil and gas industry offered me a contract to come over to the United States. And so through many, many different stories, I ended up staying.
So you've been sober 26 years.
26. My sobriety date is March the 8th of 1995. So I just turned 26 in March.
Congratulations on that. That's an amazing accomplishment. I've heard parts of your story in the past. So 25 and a half years ago, what was happening in your life that was pointing you in the direction of AA?
I'm not sure that I was aware that I was being pointed in the direction of AA, but I'm certainly glad that I ended up that way. I would say that my drinking had gotten much, much worse in the preceding 4 or 5 years until I walked through the doors. Mm-hmm. I am not one of those people that was an alcoholic right off the bat. I had many years of hard drinking. Mm-hmm. There were some consequences with that hard drinking, but it wasn't until the last 5 years when I started having blackouts that my drinking kind of fell off of the cliff. I had to drink every day. Otherwise, I wouldn't be able to function. And if I didn't have alcohol in my system, my body would react in a very unpleasant way. I would get the shakes.
Was that a gradual change that happened for you, or was that kind of one day you woke up and you were starting to black out when you drank?
The line that I crossed for the blackout was immediate. It was one Christmas Eve, and I had told myself yet again that I did not want to drink, and I had managed to string a couple of days together. And I went out to a party on Christmas Eve, and I don't remember the next couple of days, the next 48 hours really, when I came to that I'd woken up in my house and didn't really remember much about anything. And that was the first time I had a blackout. So I think from that point on, for the next 5 years, it was a rapid decline physically, and obviously the emotional and spiritual turmoil and damage that goes with that was right hand in hand. So.
Were you told about what happened during that 48 hours?
I was not. My belief is that, I had somehow struggled home and passed out on the floor and probably started drinking again when I came to, and then passed out again, and another day had passed when I finally kind of came to my senses. That was kind of a pattern in those last 5 years. I was isolated. My daughter's mother had had enough, and I was living by myself, and so there wasn't really anybody to keep an eye on me. And so there was nobody to fill in those gaps.
So we're talking about a period about 30 years ago that this was starting to happen for you.
I don't really remember the first half of the 90s. Let's put it that way.
How long had you been in the U.S. by the time that rolled around?
Let's see. I came to the U.S. in the end of 76. So I got sober in 95. Okay. So what is that? That's 19 years. I was a young man right out of school when I got here. And so for the next 19 years, my drinking went from, I don't think it was ever social. It was always fairly heavy, but it was my coping mechanism, Howard. It was the way I dealt with mistakes. It was the way I dealt with sadness. It was the way I dealt with almost every emotion that I didn't want to feel. But it was also that, feel-good thing. I liked the euphoria that it brought, and I liked the, Bill calls it the conviviality, right? And I love that. I love the clink of the glasses and, neon lights. I mean, there was an atmosphere that went with the drinking that I was also enamored of. And so, I went through those earlier years, as I say, heavily drinking with minor consequences. There was minor scrapes and minor brushes with the law, but nothing too damaging where it couldn't be repaired at that time.
Was that a cultural sort of thing? I mean, from the standpoint of when you were younger, pubs in Great Britain, people end up there as their main social gathering spot. What was your experience with pubs as you were growing up?
I think you summed it up absolutely correctly. It's a social gathering. It's where people meet. It's where friendships are made. It is where young men go to let off steam and meet young ladies. Their families sometimes go. There's sometimes beer gardens out in the back where families can sit and the adults can drink and the kids can drink sodas. over the years they've added food, and they have these things called gastropubs now. But it's very much a social place to enjoy each other's company, to enjoy alcohol. In fact, sometimes I've often joked that we give directions. I mean, directions using pubs. It's like you go down to the Green Man, turn left, go down a mile, and make a right at the King's Head. And that kind of popularity, if you will, that kind of acceptance of a pub as being an English tradition, certainly played a large part of my early life. My father, in fact, frowned upon pubs because his father was an alcoholic. And so my father didn't drink, although he had all the isms. But we were kind of tried to push us away from going to pubs. But my brother and I kind of rebelled against that. And so we ended up going to more pubs because of his disapproval. But most people in England do a lot of socializing in pubs.
Yeah, I get that. So your grandfather was an alcoholic. Did you know him when you were growing up?
I did not. He had died before I had been born. But the stories that I've heard from not just my dad, but my dad's older brothers indicate to me he was a very violent, abusive man. He was also an inveterate gambler. He spent a lot of our family finances. Used to beat my grandmother. And my father witnessed this as he was the youngest. He was the baby of the family. And so, over the years, I've come to terms with the fact that my father grew up in a terrible environment. And that was all he knew. And that kind of transcended to our own upbringing. And, I had to work long and hard on my relationship with my father way after he had passed away, actually. Yeah, he passed away when I was about a year and a half sober. And in about 4 or 5 years, I started to do some in-depth family of origin work.
I see.
Both through Al-Anon and Children of Alcoholics. Because, as I say, he didn't drink very much, but he sure had all the isms.
Yeah. Did you find some clarity and understanding? Was that experience in Al-Anon and ACA, what kind of impact did that have on you?
It was very enlightening because when I got sober, one of the things that we do in Alcoholics Anonymous is we do our 4 steps, correct? And so that first couple of 4 steps that I did, I took on a lot of the responsibility for things that had gone wrong with our family. And rightly so. There were a lot of things I had done wrong. In fact, I was off the grid for a couple of years. My parents did not know where I was. They actually got in contact with the Washington Embassy, who got in contact with the FBI, and I had a kind of a, where is this guy? Have you seen this man? And so it wasn't, there were things that I had done that I was very ashamed and guilty of. And so when I first got sober, I did those 4 steps and attributed much of the blame to my own behaviors. And I needed to do that. Yeah. But as I continued with sobriety and kind of looked at some things that were becoming apparent to me, I realized that I wasn't particularly to blame for everything that had gone on in their family. And I had to kind of categorize which things I needed to take responsibility for and which things I needed to say, what, that wasn't me. And I'm sure my dad did his best. My mother did her best. But those were things that they brought to the table and that, it had inflicted on my brother and I. My brother more so than I, but because he got the brunt. I left home at 17 and my brother was left behind, and again, he's 3 years younger than I am. And funny thing is he's not an alcoholic. He has other issues. I think he has bipolar disorder, but undiagnosed. But he does not abuse alcohol. He likes to drink, but he is not an alcoholic. It's very strange.
In your family of origin, you just mentioned about your father and his experience. Were his siblings affected? Do you have uncles and aunts that became alcoholics? And what do you know about the extended family that your dad had?
That's a great question. My dad was a very secretive man. He did not talk about his family of origin. I got much of my knowledge about my grandfather from his brothers. My dad was the youngest brother, the youngest of 7. So he was the seventh son, I believe, of the seventh son, is what they say. So he was babied. He was looked after by his older brothers. But his older brothers, I didn't really see any signs of alcoholism as a kid, but I don't think that I would have been aware of what they might be. I know they all like to drink. Mm-hmm. I know that every one of them would like to go to the pub and enjoy alcohol. Mm-hmm. Now, whether any of them were alcoholic, I don't know. Mm-hmm. Most of them lived until their 70s or their 80s. So that kind of doesn't lend itself to alcoholism in full flight. So I honestly don't know the answer to that, Howard. I think a lot of my understanding of my dad's family is skewed in some way. And my brother and I have talked about this a lot. We don't know much about my dad's early days and his youth. And the stories that we know apparently are very different from the stories that my uncles could have told if they were still alive. They're all dead. So there is something in my father's history that we don't know that is very mysterious and something that my mother doesn't even know. I have asked my mother several times and she has no idea of what my father's life was like before he met her. So it's very odd, and I don't suppose we'll ever get the answer.
And your mom is still, she's still alive?
She is. She's 92 years old.
Wow.
She lived up in by herself up until recently, but she had fallen, broken femur, and so had to be admitted to hospital. And right now she's living in an assisted living, but wants to go home. So I'm going to have to fly home here dealing with COVID in some way at some point in the near future. So
she's back in the UK, and is your brother there as well?
Yes, he is. He lives in central London. My mother lives on the outskirts of London.
Have you asked her about, or have you sat down with her and tried to get an idea about what was going on when you were young in the house?
Yes, we have. My brother and I have both sat down with her, and we've asked her in a nice way. We've sometimes cajoled her to talk about, our early lives. But my mother lives in a world of denial and almost delusional. Mm-hmm. My brother and I both remember incidents that happened in our childhood that my mother refuses to acknowledge. There was one particular incident I can remember vividly, and it involved physical abuse, and my father blacked her eye, and she had to wear sunglasses. We were actually on vacation when this occurred. And I asked her about this, in fact, the last time I went home, my brother and I were sitting there and we were talking about it, and she said that didn't happen. And I was certainly old enough, and my brother was old enough to know that it actually did happen. It wasn't that we were making this up. It wasn't that this was something that could have happened or we saw it wrong. This was an event that left an indelible scar for me anyway, and I believe also for my brother. And she refuses to even entertain the idea that some of these things happen. She has put my dad, he was 13 years older than she was. He was the first father figure she knew. She didn't know her own father. He had abandoned his family when my mother was 2 months old. Then the war came along. She was sent out of London during the Blitz. So she never had a male role model in her life. And my dad comes along, and he was very charming and very attractive, and he swept her off her feet, and he was the older man, and they had a parental-child relationship for 45 years before he died. My dad did not let my mother have a checkbook. And I remembered when my father passed away, flying back home a year and a half sober, teaching my mother how to write a checkbook so she could pay her bills. So he was a very controlling individual. He was very strict. He was very, he wanted to make sure everybody did things his way. And so, my mother put him on a pedestal, and she held that kind of belief with him even after he died. And so, in fact, after he died, he could do no wrong. You could not say anything bad about my father. So it made it very difficult for me to go to her and say, I'm looking for clarification here. I'm looking for some kind of answers. Because she just really did not want to talk about it. She had her image of him, and that was her coping mechanism. And I decided, after asking her the last time, that I was just going to leave it alone, because I was not going to get any answers, and anything that she was going to have to dredge up was going to upset her so much that it seemed to be selfish on my part to make that happen. So, I had to make peace and acceptance, right? Acceptance is the key. So I had to accept the fact that I probably am never going to find out the answers.
It's tough. Gaining no satisfaction from any corroboration is frustrating. So, it's kind of unfortunate, but it gives us the opportunity to learn to come to terms with stuff that we can't have had any power to change back then, and we certainly don't today, except for how we live with it. So, how old were you when you started drinking in earnest?
I started drinking when I was 13. I think I started drinking in earnest at 16. I used to be able to drink in a pub at the age of 16. I think the legal age is 18, but they were very lax about it. Drinking's it was very accepted when I was a teenager. You were expected to go into the pubs as a 16, 17-year-old, and nobody checked your ID. We didn't carry ID in England back then. You weren't required to have an identification on you. If you looked old enough to drink, then they would serve you behind the bar. And so 13 was my first taste, and the euphoria that came with that is never been forgotten. And then over the next few years, I stole it where I could. We had one young lad that was old enough to actually go into what they call an off license, which is a little store on the side of a pub where they sell to the public to take home. And he passed for an adult, a young adult, and so he could go in there and buy a quart of hard cider, which was one of our favorites, or a couple of bottles of beer. Then we would steal liquor from the liquor cabinet and water it down, just as everybody else probably did. And so then I started managing to actually walk into a pub by myself, as a young man, and then I would go with my friends, and we would have a few drinks and go about our merry way. And so there was also this, as I say, sense of well-being that came with drinking. It wasn't just the physical euphoria; there was the social aspect and the pleasantries that go with bonding as a youth to other young men, getting high on life, I would say, and that was part of it. So
it's very romantic. I mean, anytime I see the British, and my wife and I love to watch the BBC and the ITC shows. We love them. We have BritBox, and we watch them all, and it's such a huge part of any storyline is going into the pubs. And do you recall when you were going to the pubs with your friends, any particular person or people who were overdoing it, who might have been candidates for alcoholism at that time? Or what notice did you take of heavy drinking and drunkenness when you were that age?
That time, I didn't notice anything amiss with any of my friends. And that's borne out by the fact that of the people that I was close to in high school, or our equivalent of high school, I go back and I visit with them, and not one of them, besides me, is an alcoholic. I go meet them in a pub, and they will have a whip round, and everybody will put £10 into a jug, and they'll go buy whatever that buys, and they ask me what I want to drink, and I say, well, I have a soda water or a Diet Coke or something. And I am the only one that ended up with alcoholism, and that's my high school friends. Now, as my drinking progressed, I have noticed that the friends that I associated with later in my early 20s, and certainly my 30s, a lot of them did become alcoholics. So it's like the book says we seek lower companions, and I don't know if there's a correlation my drinking and the friends I had getting worse over the years, and my friends becoming more alcoholic prone, if that makes any sense at all. So in my teens, the people I was friends with, none of them were affected with alcoholism. In my 20s, there were a few. My college, my university friends, a couple of those were definitely showed signs of alcoholism. And then by my 30s, when I was over here in the US, there's a couple of my friends who have since died of alcoholism. And so there is that progression of my friendships that go right along with the progression of my use of alcohol.
Did you notice when you were in the pubs drinking with your friends, I'm assuming that none of them became alcoholics because none of them were probably very heavy drinkers. Did you lay off becoming a heavy drinker because of being around them and their behavior, or did you just forge ahead with drinking as much as you can, as quick as you can? What was your style of drinking back in those days?
I used to drink a little bit of beer, not much. I liked scotch, and I drank a little bit of that, and some frilly drinks like vodka and lime juice. I guess a precursor to a margarita, which I didn't really know what a margarita was back then. But and so, I liked to drink, but it was something I could still leave alone at that point. Plus, I'm living at home. So when I'm in high school, I'm living at home, so I'm confined to my access and to my accountability to not get caught by my parents, and so there were restrictions on the amount and the way I could drink, which kind of fit pretty well with where I was with it. Now, when I went to college, the restrictions all evaporated. There were no more restrictions. Then I was in the soccer club. We drank very heavily with the rugby club. We actually had two bars in our in our union building on campus. So alcohol was free and easy. It was easy to come by, and that's when I think we started to get drunk on a regular frequency. I remember one particular gentleman. He was a star rugby player, and I came out of one of the union bars one night, and he was lying half in an elevator and half out of an elevator, and the elevator doors were closing on him and hitting him in the midriff, and realizing that it were blocked, and then opening again and going through the cycle over and over again. And I saw his bruises the next day. He had bruises all the way around his midriff, but he was so passed out he didn't even realize this was happening, and we just left him there. So there was this idea that drinking was fun, and it was balls to the wall, and nobody was accountable to anybody. And if you went, it was like if you didn't go to class the next day, nobody said, "Oh, you didn't show up." It's like you just didn't get a grade if you kept it up. So there was nobody to be accountable to. No, not one person. And so that kind of exacerbated it.
I get that. That was kind of my experience too. I went to a state university that was very much a party school, and once I was there, it was the way of life. And to get into the college experience meant doing that all the time, every day. And I don't ever remember, with the exception of one or two times, ever having anything that occurred that had consequences attached to it. Did you have any situations where you got in trouble, or would that come later?
That really came much later. There were a couple of incidents that happened in college, but they were more behavioral issues that I don't think were really I could blame on alcohol.
Were drugs a part of that picture at all?
In England at the time, it was very difficult to get drugs. I experimented with pot at that time. There was LSD was available. Mandies were available. But things like heroin and cocaine were never really part of that university life when I went. Now, that I understand changed drastically in later years, but it was, and thank God, because God knows what would happen to me if I'd come across those particular substances in my formative years. I think by the time I got out of college, alcohol was my drug of choice. You know, I would smoke a little dope, but it wasn't really my thing. And so when I got to the US, drinking was legal, drinking was expected. I went into an industry where everybody drank. And so I just carried on with alcohol. And so over the years, I'd come across some of these other things, but had really very little interest in experimenting with them. I mean, I did from time to time, but they never had the hold on me that alcohol did. And it's very strange because you would think that as an addictive kind of a personality that I have, that I would fall, fall prey to those substances. But for whatever reason, I was fortunate enough never to become hooked on any of those substances. And it was alcohol that took me down. And it was a long, slow descent. And as I say, up until those last 5 years, I was managing to get by.
Yeah. So in 1976, when you left the UK to come to the US, where did you land? Where were you first working?
I landed in Lafayette, Louisiana.
Oh my gosh!
So it was out of the frying pan and into the fire, because the people in Lafayette, bless them, I love them. They were as much of a kind of crazy party animals as I had been used to dealing with back in the UK, and so they like to play too. So certainly in the oil business and in that neck of the woods, there were no holds barred, and so there was seamless. It was like you come to the US from the UK and you just keep going.
What did your drinking behavior look like, let's say, from the time you got here in 76? Where did it ramp up to before it leveled off, if it ever leveled off, or where did it ramp up to before you actually stepped off the cliff?
For a long time, I drank because it was the party-type environment. Right. It was, let's go out and have a good time. If you went to a restaurant, you would want to get a bottle of wine or drink margaritas. If you went to a party, you would take a bottle of Jack Daniels. Right. I don't really remember that I had a whole lot of alcohol in the apartments at home at that point. It was more of a going out type thing. So in the beginning, it was more for enjoyment, social activities, and just being wild. Let's put it down under that category. But what I've come to believe and what I've understood about my own journey is that I used alcohol for a lot of different things. The only time my father actually would let us drink alcohol was when we were sick as teenagers. He would give us a hot toddy with honey and hot water and lemon and a little slug of scotch. And so medicinally, I thought it was something that, it was my medicine. It was also, not to realize, it became my coping mechanism. I don't think I had ever experienced failure up until I was in my mid-20s. Everything that, even though I was raised in a less than perfect environment at home, I had succeeded in school. I had succeeded athletically. I had succeeded in my early career, really. I had left home, come to the US. I was running a crew of 6 men on oil rigs at a very early age. So, the world was my oyster, as I like to say. But I had never experienced a failure and went through a marriage and a divorce in my 20s. And it was at the end of my 20s when the wheels came off the wagon. And I had absolutely no way of coping with that divorce. And so the answer for me was just jump into the bottle. And I don't consciously remember saying I'm going to do that. But that's what I did.
How long were you married for there at that point?
3.5 years.
Was drinking a part of that marriage for the two of you?
Oh, very much so. But again, more party than using as a crutch. But once that marriage had ended, I relied on alcohol to soothe my pain, to get me through the day, to deal with the idea that I had not been able to succeed at something, that I had not been perfect at something, that I had not managed to make this thing work. And, it went downhill rapidly from there. So by the time my 30s rolled around, now I'm using alcohol to null pain, to have a good time. I'm using alcohol pretty much for everything. And so for the next 9 years until I got sober, my alcohol use increased. I'm a daily drinker, which I had not become up until that point. But somewhere around the age of 34, 35, I experienced that first blackout. And from that point on, it was nothing else mattered. I lost my job. I wrecked a car. I had a DWI. Just things, like I said, I disappeared off the grid. My parents did not know where I was. Yeah, it got pretty bad pretty quick in my mid-30s.
We'll be right back. My friends, if you're enjoying AA recovery interviews, I invite you to check out my latest audiobook, Alcoholics Anonymous, the story of how more than 100 men have recovered from alcoholism. This is the word-for-word, cover-to-cover reading of the first edition of the Big Book, published in 1939. It's a relaxing yet meaningful and engaging way to listen to the Big Book anytime, any place. Have a free listen at Audible, iTunes, or Amazon. While you're there, search for my other audiobook, Lost Stories of the Big Book, 30 original stories from the first and or second editions missing from the third and fourth editions of Alcoholics Anonymous. It's an engaging audiobook that brings these stories to life for AA members who've never seen them. These timeless testimonials were originally cut to make room for newer stories in the third and fourth editions. But their vitally important messages of hope are as meaningful today as they were when they were first published. Many listeners will hear these stories for the very first time. It's also available from Amazon as a Kindle book or in paperback if you'd like to read along. You're going to love it. And we're back. The marriage that you had, were there any children involved?
There were not. Thankfully, we did not have any children, and I had very little to do with her in subsequent years. The only contact I had with her at one point was she was a Catholic, and she wanted to have the marriage annulled way down there. In fact, I had just got sober. She had got in contact with me, and so she had written me this letter saying that she wanted to sign annulment papers, and I just bristled. I mean, I had this resentment a mile wide. This was one of the two people on my resentment list I was never going to make an amends to. And something weird happened, because as I'm listening to her, I'm thinking, I'm never going to sign. You are going to be stuck with your name being married to me for the rest of your life. And I'm saying this to myself, and all of a sudden, something in the program of Alcoholics Anonymous kicked in, and it was kind of that, do you want to be right or do you want to be happy kind of thing. And all of a sudden I thought to myself, you know what, let it go. And this had been 13 years of drinking at this woman and then getting sober and refusing to want to have anything to do with her and make an amends, right? So at that instant, God did for me what I could not do for myself, because what came out of myself was, sure, I can do that. And I signed those annulment papers and I sent them back to her, and I've never had another thing to do with her. But that's the best kind of amends I could ever make. That was the only kind of thing I could ever make. We both got married too young. We had both screwed the pooch literally on our marriage, and we both had things to be responsible for. But since there had been so much time that had elapsed, the only thing that would have made her feel any better about what had happened between us was me to be able to do this. And I know that now, but I didn't know that at the time. It was such a weight off my shoulders when I said, yeah, I'll do that. It was like all that hatred and all that resentment and all that weight of carrying that around had just evaporated in an instant. And it was like, oh my God, this stuff works.
But I often wonder about that kind of thing, Leigh. Whenever I hear people talk about it, and I've had sponsees who swore that they would never make certain amends, What was the pressure like from within when you were sitting there with an undone amend? What was it like living with that? Did you acknowledge that that was something that was bothering you, or did you find a way to ignore it or compartmentalize? Or what was your response to how you were feeling about not doing it?
When I did my fourth and fifth and the 8-step list, I kind of categorized those people who I had done more wrong to them than they had done to me. And there were two people who had done much more wrong to me than I had to them, and one of them was my ex-wife. And so I refused to make amends. Those were the two people that I never wanted to make amends to. So I justified it. Why would I want to make amends to that person who'd hurt me so badly?
So you said you were sober. How long before you actually made the amend to your first wife?
I believe it was about 2 years into sobriety. I think I had just come back from England, bury my dad, and so it was probably about 6 months after that she had sent me this letter from the Archbishop asking for me to give the go-ahead for them to annul the marriage.
So was the annulment, was that the major part of that amends, or did you actually get with her and do a classic type of amend?
No, that was the only... I really didn't want to see her. I realized in that moment that the best thing I could do was to not engage with her anymore and give her what she wanted. And that would be the form that the amends would take. And there was something I knew about that being correct. There was a feeling, a hunch, an intuition, if you will, that if I was going to, by trying to contact her and doing a face-to-face direct amends, I would be muddying the waters. There would be some unfinished thing that would come up. And this was a way of getting it closure and to let go. I had to let go of the hate.
2.5 years isn't so bad for making an amend. Were you prodded by a sponsor to do it, or by what you were hearing in meetings about other people doing theirs? Was there anything that was kind of giving you the sense that I probably ought to do this sooner than later, before she actually contacted you?
The honest truth to that is no. I had told my sponsor that I didn't know where she was, which was the truth. I did not, and that I didn't want to do it anyway. And he said, well, basically, God will do for you. God will find a way, kind of thing. Or you never know what might happen, or what sponsors say to their sponsees is, you never know, right? And so this thing kind of came out of the blue, and I was given that do you want to be right or do you want to be happy moment, and I picked the I want to be happy moment. And as I say, the relief that I felt confirmed to me very quickly, immediately, if we will, that that was the right thing to do.
That's great experience to pass on, especially to sponsees and other people, to know that deep down inside that what you did actually gave you relief and gave you the feeling of having done it in the way that needs to be done. I want to talk a little bit about your early days in AA, and when you finally got to the point at which things got bad enough for you that you said, I gotta get sober. Did you go to treatment, or did you go straight to AA? What were the first several months like for you getting sober and then going into AA?
I did not go to treatment. My last drunk, if you will, ended me up in University Hospital in San Antonio. I came to. I was on a gurney. I was strapped down with leather restraints across my stomach, and my arms and my legs were tied down. I had a couple of IV drips going. I was black and blue, and I had absolutely no idea how I'd gotten there. And the first thought that came to my mind was, how did somebody like me end up like this?
Oh, my God.
And to this day, there's many nights that previously to that I don't remember. They had asked me what date I thought it was, and the last date I could remember was February 17th, because it was a few days after Valentine's Day. I had done this rodeo before that, I figured, well, I may have missed a night or two, and so I'll just say the 20th or the 21st, and I came up with that February the 25th. Well, they said, well, no, it's March the 8th. which is my sobriety date, which is how I know what my sobriety date is. And I was absolutely flabbergasted that I knew nothing of the preceding 2 weeks. Not much of that 2 weeks has been revealed to me.
So you didn't know how you ended up in the hospital?
I have no idea how I ended up in the hospital.
A car crash or a fight or?
None at all. I guess no. I'm assuming the EMS must have brought me in. Somebody must have pulled the emergency cord on my whereabouts. Perhaps my daughter. I had a daughter by that time with a woman who probably was the source of calling the authorities and having an EMS come by, but I don't know that for sure. So I ended up in hospital and I checked myself out against medical advice. I went home. I felt like I was dying. I really did. Literally, physically felt like I was dying, and that was the end. And I wanted to go home and be in my own bed. But I decided to try to detox. I bought a bunch of Gatorade. I went to bed, I slept, I drank Gatorade, I shook, I sweated, I did the things that you do when you go through detox. I think I had a stash of Xanax at some point that I managed to wean myself off of the alcohol, but I was in pretty bad shape.
Had you ever tried getting sober before that you knew about?
Not getting sober, but I knew how to get off the alcohol.
Detoxing.
But I didn't stay sober. But I could get through the DTs by myself. I had done that several occasions.
That was in that 5-year period where things really were going downhill.
Yeah. I've probably done it 3 or 4 times previously. And so I knew the drill.
When you went home after the hospital and you figured that you were going to either get sober or die, whatever your choices were at that point, did you have a feeling that this time would be the time? Or did you have any inclination that this would be any different than any other time?
No, actually, I felt pretty hopeless. I felt more hopeless and more despair. And we talk about the gift of desperation. I was absolutely desperate and scared stiff, and knew that I could not stop by myself. I knew I could get through detox, but I didn't think that I could possibly hang on to any form of sobriety. I don't think I thought in terms of sobriety at that point. I didn't know life without alcohol. It's like I had no conception, if you will, of what life might be like without putting alcohol into my system. So I felt completely hopeless. Yeah. And I think that was the first time. I think that's what the difference was for me, that I'd kind of given up. And, we talk about surrender, but it was my idea of surrender, perhaps. It was my way of experiencing that. And it was that complete lack of belief that anything was ever going to be okay. We talk about God things in AA, and I truly believe that, God brought me to AA and AA brought me to God, because what happened to me, in answer to your question, is that there was a knock at my door, and I had probably 3 days out of the hospital, and I'm still shaky, and I still had cheap pop-off vodka pouring out my pores. I stank. So this gentleman had heard through my child's mother that I had been drinking myself to death, and this gentleman from AA was visiting from Michigan. His name was Al. It was the first time I'd seen him. He knocked on my door and he said, "Perhaps you might like to come to an AA meeting with me." And I was, like I said, I was so beaten down and so desperate. I said, okay. I'd heard of AA. I didn't really know what it was about. But I said, okay. And so I went with this gentleman and I went to a meeting on the west side of San Antonio in one of the barrios. It was a little church. I went into this meeting and I sat down and I was rocking back and forth on my hands just because I was shaky and I was literally coming apart at the seams. And felt awful. I had to wear sunglasses indoors because the light hurt my eyes. As I say, I was, I stank of cheap vodka.
Real mess, huh?
And so I sat there and I watched, and I remember seeing all these people sitting around the middle table, the people who were really part of AA, and I'm sitting on the side with this gentleman, and the lady who was chairing the meeting, leading the meeting that night, she walked in, and she was probably a few years older than I am, And she had a very nice hairdo, and she had some jewelry on that was very, nice, not too much bling, but very, very sophisticated, very well dressed. And she had a tinkle in her. I could hear her laughing, and I could hear that tinkle in her laugh. And she just had this smile on her face, and she just radiated happiness. And so she sat down at the table, and she started the meeting. And when she opened her mouth, I heard an English accent came out of this woman's mouth.
Oh, my gosh.
And I looked at the gentleman who had brought me, and I said, "That lady's from England." And he said, "Yes, she is." He said, "I've been visiting for the last couple of weeks, and she's an English lady, and she's a regular at this meeting." He said, "I will introduce you to her after the meeting is over." And I don't remember what they said at that AA meeting. I was too far gone. But I remember that woman, and I remember going up to her with this gentleman at the end of the meeting, and she looked at me, and she said, "You don't ever have to feel this way again." Then she said something that changed my life. She said, "You're going to come to the meeting tomorrow night, aren't you?" And she gave me the address, and she told me the time. And if it had been an American that said that, I don't know what I probably would have gone, I don't know. But the fact that she was an English woman, and it turns out she had been born and raised about 5-10 miles away from the place I had been born and raised in. Met her in the barrios of San Antonio in a little church. Now, if that's not a God thing, I don't know what is. Because I tell you what,
real God
at 8:15 the next night, I was at that meeting she had told me about. And I went to that meeting for the first year of my sobriety. I went, her and her husband, that lady, she's still sober, her name's Terry S. That lady and her husband took me under their wing, and they took me to AA meetings. They introduced me to my first sponsor. They protected me. They loved me until I could love myself, as they say.
Oh, that's great.
And they introduced me to the concept of AA. And what's more important, they introduced me to the concept of service. One of the things that Terry was very big on was doing service work, and she was very big in the correctional facilities. And so she introduced me to my first sponsor. One of his prerequisites to sponsor me was that I would go to the jails with him in the TDCJ, go down to the Dolph Briscoe unit in Dilley, Texas, every Monday night, and we did that. And early sobriety, I would hate going, and then I would feel a sense of gratitude at the end of the meeting when we came out of the jail, and then I would be on cloud nine coming back, and I did that for a long time. And so, I jumped into AA with both feet. I heard my stories in AA. I related to the people in AA. I knew I was at home in AA. I heard, I felt for the longest time that nobody had done the things that I had done, or felt the way I had felt, or thought the way I thought, right? And then I go into AA, and I'm in a room full of them wherever I go. The only thing that I had problems with early on in sobriety was the God thing, the concept of a higher power. That took a lot longer for me to kind of get a hold of and wrap my feelings around and wrap my brain around. For the longest time, it was good orderly direction and group of drunks.
Oh, yeah.
That sustained me for long enough.
Yeah, so it was one of those things that you had to prove to yourself through the things that were happening that God was doing for you what you couldn't do for yourself. Somewhere along the way, the things that you were doing and the guidance you were getting.
Yeah. I'm a slow learner, Howard. At 9 months, it became very apparent to me that, in fact, there was a higher power at work in my life. So it was Christmas, and so I had sobered up in March, and it was coming around to Christmas, and I had gone to a midday meeting, and they were going to have an eating meeting so that they were going to have a potluck after the 12 o'clock, right? So 1 o'clock they were going to have this potluck dinner. And I'm sitting next to the table where the food's been stored, or placed. And the meeting starts, and the meeting is about this concept of a higher power, about God doing for you what you can't do for yourself. The idea that there is something at work that's greater than you. And I listened and I listened. I just was not getting this idea. I didn't understand what they were talking about. And at the end of the meeting, and it's volunteer in San Antonio, at the end of the meeting, I stuck up my hand and I said, I'm not getting this. I don't get it. I've been sober 9 months. Nothing's happening along this line of finding this higher power. I don't get step 3. I'm really not getting step 2. I said, all I'm thinking about right now is having a slice of this cherry pie that's sitting on the end of this table. And something in the back of my head, just like the light bulb came on. It was like, for 9 months, I had not thought about putting alcohol in my system. And the only craving I had was for a piece of cherry pie. And I realized at that moment that this was working for me, that AA had worked for me for 9 months. And I hadn't even realized it. Before I had walked into the rooms of AA, I could not go 24 hours without putting alcohol in my system. I had proved it. And even when I didn't want to drink, I couldn't stop. And since I staggered into that first meeting where I met that English lady, it had not been necessary to put alcohol in my system again. And it took 9 months for that idea to filter through my thick skull. But at that particular moment, when I was craving that piece of cherry pie and not craving a bottle of Jack Daniels, it became very apparent to me that something was at work in AA that I had no control over. It was nothing to do with me, and that I was being taken care of.
What a marvelous revelation that must have been for you at that point. I didn't get that until it was probably 18 months, until I had done the steps with a sponsor who was very God-focused. My first year, I was on my own, and I didn't have a sponsor. And there's a lot to be said for being guided into a spiritual path. So you did it in 9 months. I finally got it around 18 months, and the important thing is we got it when we got it. So your program, I'm assuming your program became energized from that experience.
Actually, my program started from that point. I was just going to meetings and enjoying the camaraderie and the fellowship and I was learning about AA. I guess I was auditing it, but at that point, I think I realized that it was either time to do the steps and get serious about it, because I was just kind of I was given that 9 months of grace. I believe God gave me a 9-month grace period just to become part of AA in the fellowship. And you said you had worked the steps before your spiritual awakening. I think I got that spiritual awakening in some form or another before I even started to work the steps. I got that realization that God was working in my life in dealing with my alcoholism before I got to start the steps in earnest. So I didn't really start the steps for about 9 months. So
how much more comfortable you must have been, though, working the steps with that in your hip pocket than I was starting out trying to work the steps without belief. So I get that. In the last 26 years, what have been some of the milestones for you in sobriety? I know that you moved from San Antonio to Houston at some point, but what are some of the things that stick out to you in 2.5 decades of sobriety?
Oh, wow. That's a great question, and so many good things. You mentioned the fact that I moved. I was 15 years sober, and my boss in San Antonio came to my office one Friday afternoon, said, we are going to sell your department to a much bigger company in Houston. The good news is that they want you to go with them. The bad news is that there's no room for you here if you don't want to go. So, and I will tell you that probably moving in sobriety was one of the most difficult things that I have experienced in sobriety, because it was like becoming a newcomer all over again. Mm-hmm. I had a big network of people in San Antonio that I knew, that I was, had that fellowship with, and all of a sudden that was going to be gone. And I had to come to Houston and start over again. And at least I knew the drill, but it still felt very odd being kind of a newcomer in a new city.
Did you have a hiatus from AA during that period of time where you were trying to get acclimated?
No, I dove more so into AA. In fact, it boosted my program a lot. I knew that if I wanted to stay sober or at least be sane, I would have to redouble my efforts. And so when I got here, I went to 2 meetings a day if I could. I stuck my hand up whenever people say, does anybody want to share? It was very unusual. It was a hard concept for me to get used to this idea of being called upon rather than volunteering. Sure. I remember going to a meeting, and I had not shared in a meeting for several meetings, maybe a week or two, and I got here, and finally somebody at a meeting said, does there anybody want to share? And my hands stuck up in the air, and I just let go, and I said, I don't know anybody here, but I want to share, and here it is. And so, and I got to know people. I just knew to stay close. I knew to reach out to people and say, hey, I need help. And asking for help is still the most difficult thing for me to do in sobriety, right?
Oh, yeah.
But I knew that's what I had to do. So I doubled my efforts when I moved here from San Antonio. So other things that have happened in my life, I think, losing my dad was the first major thing that cropped up. That was about a year and a half. My daughter, becoming a dad and becoming a real dad, the blessings that come with becoming a good parent and seeing somebody grow up and become successful in their own right and have a good relationship with a grown adult child. That was such a gift for me. I can remember one particular incident. My daughter was probably about 10, maybe 11. I was 5-6 years sober, basically. And we were sitting at the breakfast table, and she was having trouble with her math homework. And we were sitting there I was trying to explain it to her, and I was getting frustrated, and I was getting more and more frustrated. And then I started to get angry, and then my voice started to raise. And there was this moment of clarity when I said to myself, I could hear, it was almost like an out-of-body experience. I said to myself, you are becoming your dad. Stop it. And I made a decision at that particular instant to not engage in trying to make her do her homework right. Okay, if that makes any sense.
Sure.
I left her alone. And so the immediate upshot of that is she struggled with math for a bit, and if she got a C, I'd say, well, did you try your best? And she'd say yes, and I'd say, okay. And I would not demand that she get A's and B's and that kind of thing. And the next semester she went to school, her math was back on track. It was like she was getting good grades. And so that hands-off, that do nothing, the do nothing then rest mentality kind of thing, because doing nothing is so hard for me to do. That do nothing has served me so well in not only building a relationship with my daughter from that point on, but in life in general. I think I want to go ahead and fix things. I want to go ahead and take action to solve a problem. That's my nature. But sometimes the best thing to do is to let things be. Pause when agitated, if you will. But on a longer term, is just stop. Just let it unfold the way it's supposed to be unfolding, and don't try to manipulate and justify and get things the way you think it's supposed to be. Even if your intentions are good, right?
Yeah.
I think just leaving things alone when you don't really know what to do.
It's hard to get comfortable with that, though, Leigh. And I've often found that I'm pretty good at, does it need to be said? Does it need to be said now? Do I need to be the guy saying it? And I keep my mouth shut. And it's kind of uncomfortable for a little while, but looking back, I can always see where that was the right thing to do. So I've had to glean comfort intellectually after the fact, to the point that now when I do hold my tongue or I don't say what I'm thinking in a hurtful way or whatever, I can do that more proactively and know that it's the right thing to do. Sounds to me like you've had that kind of experience too.
Absolutely. And as you say, it's very hard to do, and still to this day is very, very difficult to stop and just say, okay, I don't know what to do. The best thing I can do is to leave that alone. That doesn't come naturally to me, and still to this day is sometimes, it's not my first thought, but it sometimes will be my second thought if I'm lucky, and usually it's like a third or fourth thought is to say, okay, stop. Just stop.
Yeah. especially when we find ourselves with grown children. I mean, adults in their late 20s and 30s, that they come to visit or they come to stay, and how easy it is to slide back into that parental role, that, you know, the time to have influenced their life in the way that I think I still can, that time came and went 15, 20 years ago, and I have to remind myself of that. So your daughter, she's a grown woman now.
Yeah, she's 32 years old. She's a practicing attorney in San Antonio. She remained in San Antonio when I got transferred to Houston.
So you've stayed, so that was at about 5 years, you said, of sobriety.
A lot of things happened to me recently. So that's just before COVID. I've been dating somebody in Brenham.
Right.
And we had met in a meeting in Houston. And corresponded for a little bit, and we kind of saw each other for a little bit, and then we started dating seriously. I would run up one weekend and she would come to visit me the next weekend, and so on, and we saw each other during the week once in a while. And I was getting on for retirement age, and so I started to plan retiring and didn't really know when I was going to pull the plug on that. And I think you and I had actually talked about it. You know, you had given me some good feedback on that. And so I had been working towards it. Both of us had wanted to take our relationship further. And you know, one of the gifts of AA, and another gift is the ability to be in a healthy relationship. It took me a long time to figure out, you know, what a healthy relationship looked like. I was given a gift of figuring that out. I met somebody. We had to go slow because of the distance. And at some point in my career, I realized I wasn't enjoying what I was doing anymore, and that I was ready to pull the plug. And, you know, I had been worrying up until that point about whether it was the right time. And one morning I woke up and I knew intuitively it was the right time. And I have not looked back since. So upshot of retiring is that I got to move to Brenham and be with my sweetheart. And although we're not married, we are committed. We're in a committed relationship. We've both been married before, and it wasn't something that was particularly on either one of our radar. We weren't really. I wasn't looking for a relationship when we met, and I don't think she was either. And so, as things progressed, we had talked about, you know, well, what does that look like, marriage? Well, it's not necessary for you. It's not necessary for me. Let's just roll with it. And you know, we've talked about, you know, down the road we may take that plunge, and it's not something we feel that any undue pressure to do, but we might do it just because we want to do it. And I think that's the right reason. We do the things that married people do. We committed to each other. We're raising children together. You know, we have our things that are you know, deal breakers, and for everything else is we'll work through it and make the relationship work. We practice the traditions of Alcoholics Anonymous in our relationship. She is one of our members too, and so we try to bring the traditions that we learn in AA into our relationship. Like, our common welfare should come first. The well-being of the relationship comes before the well-being of each of us as individuals, and we live by that. We try to live by that. We don't always succeed, but that's always in the back of our minds. And so the only requirement for this is to desire to be in the relationship. Do we want to be in the relationship? Absolutely. So we can apply traditionally the things that we learn in AA, in the program of recovery, into our relationship, and it's beautiful.
It sounds beautiful. I mean, it's a remarkable realization that a good marriage is built out of that very thing, and how easy on a daily basis it must be for you to acknowledge God's presence in your relationship along with everything else in your life, huh?
Absolutely. That part of the traditions also is, you know, loving God as we understand Him. And so, you know, that is been fundamental, I think, in any success that we've had in this blossoming thing. It's ongoing. I mean, we continue to grow. And so, you know, I attribute everything that's good that's happened in my life to either directly being sober or the blueprint for the design for living that I've learned in the rooms of Alcoholics Anonymous, because I have no clue how to behave. I mean, I still have no clue. My first instinct is to react, right? My first instinct is, how does that affect me? My second thought today, due to the fact that I'm in recovery, is that, okay, what's the right thing to do? What is the next right thing? What should I do? What would Howard do? What would Jesus do? Whatever you want to do. What does it look like to be a man in recovery? Does this lend itself to me becoming the person that I want to be, or not? And if the answer is yes, then you know it's the right thing to do. And if it's not, then you better think twice about doing it. My old sponsor in San Antonio used to say, Leigh, you can do anything you want if you're prepared to take the consequences. And I believe that 100%. That has been a guiding light in my life. Is that, do I want to pay the consequences for my actions today?
After unpacking so much of your life for us, you've repacked it in a really wonderful way about the impact of AA on your life, on your relationships, on your way of thinking. Everything seems to be nicely arranged for a man to live a good, sober life. And I see you doing that. You have a certain peace and serenity about you. And I've always thought, well, maybe it's that English reservedness, or, that kind of understated stiff upper lip. But after hearing your whole story, it gives me an incredible sense of knowing the man behind the legacy, let's say. This has been a really great way for us to reconnect after having not talked in a little while. We talk from time to time. I think last time I called you, it was to get the name of a barber that you used. Oh, that's right.
Did you ever get a haircut?
Yeah, I did. Thank goodness for that. My hair got pretty much out of control. At first I said, I am not going to cut my hair until they find a cure for this thing. And my hair went so out of control that I finally had to find some other cause to get behind. It was that was, I guess, the last time we talked. But this has been a really fine opportunity that I'm so glad I was able to have you enjoy with me, and I hope it was enjoyable for you as it was for me.
It was very enjoyable for me, Howard. Just sitting here conversing with you is just, we just do the deal the best of our ability, and we're rewarded so much more for our efforts. So it's wonderful to see you, my friend.
It's good seeing you, and thanks so much for doing this.
All right, Howard. I'll see you soon.
Well, my friends, that's a wrap for today's episode of AA Recovery Interviews. Thank you for tuning in. If you've enjoyed AA Recovery Interviews, will you please tell others how to listen to it? It's yet another helping hand we can all extend to alcoholics everywhere. If you want to contact me directly with any comments, questions, or suggestions, simply email howard@aarecoveryinterviews.com. By the way, this podcast strictly adheres to AA's 12 traditions and all General Service Office guidelines for safeguarding anonymity online. I pay all production costs. AA Recovery Interviews and my guests do not speak for or represent AA at large. This podcast is simply my way of giving back to AA that which has been so freely given to me. The next new episode of AA Recovery Interviews is on the way, so keep coming back. It'll be here soon.